The interesting thing is that although they've got a huge majority and the working majority will be of 170 or so, they've only, in fact, received slightly less than 2% more votes from the British public than they did last time. So what's happened is not so much that there is an overwhelming vote of confidence in the Labour Party. It is a sense that, throw the bums out, if you like, that the Conservatives had run out of road and run out of trust and run out of support. And people have, to some extent, voted for the Labour Party. Certainly 10% more voted for Labour than for Conservatives. But there's also been 14% for the right-wing anti-European party of Nigel Farage. And the Scottish Nationalists lost big time to Labour in Scotland. And the Liberal Democrats have won more seats. They're going to have 71 seats in the new parliament, which is a historic high. They've never done that well since the party came into being. So everybody has done well, except for the Conservatives.
Which leads to at least an interesting question, which is, normally we think about a mandate when you have this large a majority. If it was a vote against the Conservatives more than it was for Labour, when it comes to policies, what did the British people vote for in terms of policies?
The slogan which the leader of the Labour Party came up with after road testing a number of different options was one word: change. And their focus groups and political scientists told them that that was what the British electorate really wanted to hear. These guys, the Conservatives, have been in power for the last 14 years. We've had COVID, we've had Brexit, which hasn't gone well. We've got very little economic growth. We've got no productivity. Investment and exports have been patchy, if not down, in a whole lot of different issues, and stagnant middle-class incomes over the last probably 20 years, which has upset a lot of people. So they voted for change. They voted to get rid of the guys who've been in charge for the last 14 years. But the Labour Party was very cautious about not being very specific in terms of what that change would bring. They didn't want to talk about Brexit, which almost three-quarters of the British people now recognize was a mistake. Doesn't mean to say three-quarters of the British people want to go back into the European Union, but most people reckon that was a mistake. They didn't really get discussed. The Tories didn't want to talk about it because it was their handiwork, and the Labour Party didn't want to talk about it because they were frightened of losing votes which had become first-time Conservative voters and who were traditionally their supporters.
A change, but not a change in taxes, as I understand it. We're not going to increase taxes, and yet we want to increase growth, productivity, and investment. How do you do those two things fiscally? Where do you come up with the money for that?
Well, they're going to have a little bit of a cushion fiscally because they revised the numbers for growth, and we're now looking at 0.7% for the first quarter of this year, whereas people thought it was pretty much stagnant. So there's a little bit more growth coming in. There is quite a lot less inflation. We were up at 11% last year at the highest point, and we're down at 2% now. There isn't any evidence at the moment of productivity increase. Exports have surprised people by doing a bit better, particularly, of course, to non-European markets. So there's a little bit of extra cushion, extra wiggle room coming in there. But the other thing, David, to be clear about is that they've said we will not be raising income tax and we will not be raising corporation tax. But they have not said they won't, and they will not be raising VAT, which is a sales tax. But they have not said anything about capital gains tax. And they've not said anything about some of the other business-specific taxes. They've not said anything about windfall taxes for energy companies, which have made a lot of money out of the rise of global prices as a result of the Ukraine conflict, and so on. So the big headline tax issues, they've said, no, we won't mess with that. But they haven't excluded some other things, and they are going to put tax on private education fees, which nobody's ever done before in the United Kingdom, which will raise a bit of money. And they have done something which the Tories had already done, which was to change the non-dom, as we call it, the non-domicile tax regime for very wealthy people who have an expatriate status and who live in the UK but don't get taxed on any of the wealth that they have outside Britain. They're changing all that, which the Conservatives already promised to do it. The Labour Party say they'll go further. I'm not sure how much further they'll go. I worry that we might just drive away a lot of the wealth that we need for our economy at a time when it's still pretty fragile. So there are some areas of tax where they've got the option to raise more money, but they are scared of being deemed to be business unfriendly. And you may have noticed that even in the first day or two after the election, stock markets rallied, sterling did a bit better. The business community, at the moment anyway, doesn't seem to be too scared. And they probably quite like the idea that with a whopping great majority, there is going to be some political stability and maybe some policy stability for the next 4 or 5 years.
Sir Peter, let's talk about the relations between the United Kingdom and Europe. You mentioned the name that must not be named in the campaign of Brexit that nobody wanted to talk about. What do you anticipate this Labour government might do with respect to Brexit? I understand maybe not pull back entirely, but maybe modify it around the edges.
Keir Starmer has said, and so have his other ministers, that there will be no return to the single market or to the customs union under a Labour government. So that's pretty definitive in terms of not turning the clock back to pre-Brexit days. Was that necessary to ensure that they got a substantial majority? Perhaps. It may also be realistic in that the price of going back on the deal, which is very Europe favorable, frankly, the price of going back on the deal negotiated by Boris Johnson would be quite considerable. There would have to be a restoration of free movement of labor, which is free movement of people, which is a political hot potato, especially for the Conservatives, but it's also going to be tricky for the Labour Party.